The Kyosho Legendary Series. They don't make them like they used to. Hi, my name is David and you're watching Kai City RC. Welcome back to the channel. This is going to be my final wrap-up review and thoughts on the complete Legendary Series buggies from Kyosho. If you're interested in any of these, stick around and stay tuned and I'll tell you all I can about them. I also have a couple of other videos on the Legendary Series, one specific looking at the two-wheel drive buggies, another the four-wheel drive buggies. Now both of those videos are a little bit older and were done before I'd completed the entire collection, but they still might be worth a look-see, so I'll put a link in the description below. But before we go any further, I really must apologize for the length of this video. I've been thinking for a while now how to cover all 9 Legendary Series buggies in a single video, but still keep it as useful and concise as possible. And the truth is, there just isn't any easy way for me to do it. I guess I'll try and keep things roughly chronological, but I'll also try and give my recommendations on to which one you should buy. Another disclaimer as well, I know a fair bit about the Kyoshos, but I'm no expert and I'm only human, so I will apologize in advance for any errors or omissions or anything like that. Also, when it comes to release dates and just dates in general, be aware that there may be some differences depending on where you are in the world. I believe that Japan tended to get releases earlier than the rest of the world, so your dates might not match mine. Now, for those with limited time and better things to do than listen to me waffle on for 30 odd minutes, here are my quick recommendations. Okay, here we go. If you're in the market for your first, but I can guarantee you it probably won't be your last, Kyosho Legendary Series re-release buggy, then my recommendation would be any of them. They're all great. There are no bad ones in the bunch. None of them have any major shortcomings or issues, but if you really insist on my recommendation, get the Turbo Scorpion. If it has to be four-wheel drive, buy the Javelin. Next, if you plan to regularly run one on a track, for two-wheel drive, choose the Ultima. For four-wheel drive, go with the Optima Mid. If you're looking for something that's got a really old-school vibe, buy the Javelin and build it with the chain drive. If you hate painting bodies, choose the Javelin. If you hate painting driver figures, don't choose the Scorpions or the Ultima, as the driver figure is integrated into the shell. Although you do get decals for some of the driver figures, you still kind of need to do painting. If you want something suited to driving in very dusty, muddy, dirty or even wet conditions, seriously consider the Beetle. Its bathtub chassis has an inner polycarbonate cover, and that combined with the outer Beetle body really just it offers the best weather protection. If you're concerned about parts availability, I'd go with either one of the older two-wheel drive variants, so the Scorpions and the Tomahawk. I don't have official sales figures, but given that both Scorpions, the Beetle, and to a lesser extent the Tomahawk share many parts, it's just often easier to find parts for those buggies. And the Scorpion, I believe, was the original re-release back in 2014, so it's been a while. It's been around for a while now. If you want minimal maintenance, choose one of the two-wheel drive buggies. If you're hell-bent on installing some high-powered brushless setup, choose the Mid. If you want something that's easier to maintain, avoid the Optima, Turbo Optima and Javelin. Again, access to diffs and the inner workings is just more complicated on those buggies. Now, when it comes to electronics, space for ESCs with fans and such like larger ESCs is limited on everything, but it's particularly limited on the Mid, so just be aware of that. Okay, now before I start talking about the individual buggies that make up the Legendary Series, a bit of an overview. I really do think at this point it's important to mention a couple of things about Kyosho Legendary Series re-release buggies and how they compare with other re-releases from Tamiya. Now, I'm going to assume that most people watching this already own or at least familiar with Tamiya's re-releases. Tamiya have chosen to keep their re-releases as true as possible to the originals. Consequently, little has been done to improve or modify the original design. For most buggies, the only real substantial differences might be the replacement with the decals with something, that doesn't have any kind of copyright issues or anything like that, licensing issues. Occasionally, there may be some minor modifications usually to increase compatibility with modern day electronics. But overall, the design and the specifications rarely differ from those back in the day. From a purist point of view, this is ideal, and it's nice to build a kit knowing that this is just how it was all those years ago. But it also means that any kind of design weaknesses are carried over. Kyosho, in contrast, choose to modify their original designs to offer better performance, durability, and ease of maintenance, while still keeping true to the original designs. I've heard and read several reasons for why they chose this route, the most common one being that Kyosho no longer had access to the original molds, and so they literally had to recreate the buggies from scratch. A cursory comparison between an original and a re-release would likely result in the conclusion, oh, they're pretty much the same. But dig deeper and a whole host of minor differences become apparent. Just to give you a couple of examples, the gears and transmission in all of them has now been updated to 48-pitch modern day style gear systems. The chassis is now all the holes on the underside are countersunk and use flathead screws. Almost all the screws used in the kits are hex hardware. Kyosho even mentions that they did their best to reduce the number of screws and bolts, and certainly the number of self-tapping screws, to make construction easier, more straightforward, and more durable. A lot of the materials used are different, so Kyosho opted to use more modern day aluminium alloys in the components, gears, etc, etc. Now, generally speaking, the Kyosho Legendary Series kits are quite expensive when compared to those from, example, Tamiya. But the quality is top notch. I mean, they are mostly made from high grade metals, aluminium. Though the later buggies, the Mid and the Ultima, do feature more plastic. That said, the plastic used is of the highest quality. Overall, you really do get a sense of quality and solidness when building a Legendary Series kit. It goes without saying, full bearings are included. The manuals themselves are straightforward, easy to follow. They offer plenty of option parts, little things, nice touches like the decals are all die cut for easy application. When you open the box, all the kits come nicely presented with many of the metal parts on display in blister packs. So without further ado, let me introduce you to the first buggy in the Legendary Series, the Scorpion. It was released in, well, depending on where you look, 1982, early 1983, along with the Kyosho Beetle. Kyosho decided to thoroughly modernize the design, the manufacturing process. So if you compare the re-release to the original, you'll find that there's just so many small, subtle, but purposeful differences between the two. Now, under the body, the Scorpion and the Beetle are essentially the same buggy. The chassis is two parallel aluminium rails onto which the plastic electronics box and then the rear gearbox plate mounts. The gearbox in the Tomahawk, the Scorpion, the Beetle and Turbo Scorpion comes partially pre-assembled from the factory. Pretty much the entire buggy is metal with very few plastic parts. The suspension is very old school designed, real trailing arm, front and rear. It's a little quirky to set up, but once you've got it set up, it actually works remarkably well. You'll be very surprised at how small the dampers are on the stock dampers are on the cars, but they're all very well made. Some people say they are prone to leaking, but I've personally not found that to be a problem. In fact, the only dampers that I've ever had issues with leaking are the ones fitted to my Scorpion, which are the HG upgraded shocks. All of the standard shocks that I fitted to my kits, I've never had a problem with leaking. There is plenty of space in the electronics box for most modern day ESCs, receivers, etc. The entire driveline has been modernized, so it uses 48-pitch metal gears. It can handle brushless power without problems. The only thing I would caution is the Scorpion, the Beetle and the Tomahawk, the rear wheels do not use hex design. They're actually friction fitting. So I guess if you start to really up the power, you might have an issue where the wheels could actually slip. You do have slip clutches on basically all of the kits in the Legendary Series range. The Beetle is almost identical to the Scorpion. The only real differences are the fittings necessary to mount the Beetle shell onto the chassis. I have a detailed video comparing the Kyosho Beetle with the Tamiya Sand Scorcher, so if you're interested, I'll put a link in the description. Go and check that out. The Beetle body is nowhere near as nicely detailed as the Tamiya one, but it's much more suited for regular use. It stands up to rollovers and collisions much better. It does come with the option to fit light wide buckets in the front, which is what I've done. Now later in 1983 saw the release of the Tomahawk. Now the Tomahawk was just designed to be superior at racing. It was made to be lighter, more responsive and stable. The plastic bathtub chassis was thrown out and replaced with a small FRP electronics deck. It's a big departure from the earlier Scorpion and Beetle. The battery now mounts transversely across the chassis towards the rear to put more weight over the rear wheels. Now Kyosho's efforts on weight reduction on the Tomahawk are really noticeable, and it has a much lighter feel to it. I find that it's willing to lift up the front much sooner, and even with the brushed Le Mans 32 motor, it will want to wheelie often. Like the Beetle and the Scorpion before it, the kit includes 2 sets of gears, so you can tailor the gear ratio to suit your needs. When complete though, the Tomahawk has this very minimalistic feel to it. From a builder's perspective, it's probably the least involved because there just isn't a lot to it. I really love the way the Tomahawk handles, and compared to when you have it side by side by most of the other models in this range, it seems very low down, almost like a race car in fact. Its lightweight just means it accelerates, brakes and jumps noticeably better than the other two-wheel drive buggies from that era. The only downside I would say is it does, out of all of the Legendary series, it has the most, I want to say flimsiest feel to it, simply because there's no bathtub sitting between those chassis rails. That's not to say that it breaks easily. I've crashed mine more times than I care to mention, but out of all of the Legendary series, the Tomahawk has the least solid, robust feeling to it. I mean, it's all relative though. So that brings us to 1985 and the release of the Kyosho Optima. This time, four-wheel drive was just exploding in popularity, and Kyosho wanted in on the action. Now, back in the day, dirt tracks, off-road tracks were much rougher than they are now. The suspension had to work a lot harder. Big jumps weren't really a thing. It was just rougher terrain. The tracks tended to be loose dirt, and so one of the biggest issues back in the day was just traction. So Kyosho decided to go with a rear motor mount Optima. Now, they were aware that a mid motor mount would give greater maneuverability, but possibly at the expense of rear traction. I really like the Optimus chassis design. So it uses parallel aluminium rails like the two-wheel drive variants, but they're much closer together. So when you take the body off, the chassis has a very, very narrow design to it, a very compact design. When the chassis is built, it just has this wonderful, solid feeling to it. There's no flex whatsoever. Now, much like the earlier re-releases, Kyosho went through and thoroughly modernized the small details. So, of course, it uses countersunk screws, it uses hex hardware, full bearings, 48 pitch gears, it includes a slipper clutch, and a host of other minor, subtle improvements that you wouldn't really notice unless you had an original Optima and a re-release side by side and about 30 minutes to look through them and notice all the subtle differences between them. Now, the Optima kit comes with both the original chain and sprockets, or you can fit the belt and pulley system. I opted to go with the belt and pulleys just because it's less maintenance and a little bit less resistance in the drivetrain, losses, friction, etc., etc. But if you really wanted to go for a full old school build, then you could do the sprockets and chains. When it comes to fitting electronics into the Optima, any of the Optimas or Javelin, modern day ESC's receivers will fit without issue. You can, if you wanted, if you were stuck for space, you don't have to fit the inner driver figure, which is polycarbonate, basically a polycarbonate shell that fits over the electronics tray area. You can actually not fit that if you want, and that will give you a bit more room for a larger ESC if you so wished. Batteries are held in by Velcro battery straps, so it means that a variety of different battery sizes will fit without issue. In standard configuration, the receiver will actually mount under the driver figure on the upper side of the electronics tray, so it's quite well protected from dirt, debris. And the ESC mounts on the underside of the chassis. For my Turbo Optima though, I opted to fit both of them on the upper deck and just forego installing the driver figure. I felt with the Turbo Optima, you weren't really going to see the driver figure anyway. One thing I will mention though is the kit for the Optima, also the Javelin and the Turbo Optima, they don't come with universals at the front. Now, I've personally had minor issues with the dog bones binding up at full lock, which seems to be due to the fact that a little bit on the short side. Interestingly though, this only affected my Javelin and Turbo Optima. It was never an issue on my Optima. Now, further to that, a couple of other things. First, the universals, part number OTW125B, are notoriously hard to get hold of, and they sell out almost immediately. Secondly, when building the Turbo Optima, I noticed the manual differs slightly from the Optima and Javelin. Specifically, Kyosho have you install an O-ring, ORG04SSBK, between the dog bone and the diff cup. There is no mention of this in the Javelin or Optima manuals. At first, I thought that Kyosho were aware of the potential issue with the release of the Turbo Optima and kind of offered a fix, but digging a little deeper, I noticed the Turbo Optima uses hard lower suspension arms, part number OT201HB, compared with the Optima's standard lower suspension arms, OT201. I haven't measured the two side by side, but I suspect they may be slightly different in lengths. That would explain why in the install manual for the universal shafts, Kyosho have you place a small spacer collar on the wheel hex side of the axle on the Optima and Javelin, but the inboard side close to the universal joint on the Turbo Optima and Ultima. That's something I overlooked when building the Turbo Optima, and consequently found that the universal shaft seemed to be too short. Overall though, the Optima was my first four-wheel drive Kyosho, and I was just blown away by the parts quality, the design, the sense of solidness. It is a fantastic buggy. If at this point you've only ever built Tamiyas, for example, any of the Thundershot family or Big Rig, or I guess even things like the VQS, the Vanquish, and yeah, I'm gonna say the Tamiya Egress and stuff like that, you will just be very pleasantly surprised by the build quality of the Kyosho kit. Okay, it's 1986, time for the Javelin. This one is without a doubt my favorite from the series. Well, my favorite four-wheel drive. The Turbo Scorpion gets my vote for two-wheel drive. Underneath, the Optima and the Javelin are almost identical. Indeed, it really wouldn't take much to convert one into the other. Just like the Optima before it, the Javelin has been fully modernized. Kyosho made some minor changes to the design to improve rigidity, including a heavy-duty roll bar and some more secure fittings to the external cage. I will say the Javelin oozes old school cool, but Kyosho's promo photos and even the box artwork, they just don't do the buggy justice. I know the orange color is not that popular, but you can change the cage color. Kyosho offer, what do they offer? They offer red, black, white, yellow, and light green as alternative cage colors. Some are much more harder to get hold of than others. You can also change the rear wing, and of course the wheels and tires. So on my Javelin, the first thing I did, I knew from the get-go I didn't want to go with the orange, so I replaced it with the white cage, red wing, and black wheels. And I think it looks 100 times better. But looks are totally subjective. Aside from doing some painting on the driver figure, there is no body to be painted. The wing is nylon, so you don't have to paint that. So if painting is not your forte, I highly recommend you go with the Javelin. 1986 also saw the release of the Turbo Scorpion. Now the Turbo Scorpion, both the original back in the 80s and this new re-release, have several small but noticeable improvements over the earlier Scorpion and Beetle design. Most obvious is the shift to the larger 2.2 inch wheels that use hex fittings. Like I said earlier, the older Scorpion, Beetle and Tomahawk use friction fittings for the rear wheels. Less obvious though are changes to the chassis dimensions. The Turbo has 20mm wider front tread, and thanks to a different gearbox mount, 10mm long wheelbase. The shocks are slightly larger too, so all this helps provide better stability and makes the Turbo Scorpion feel slightly more stable on rough terrain than the Scorpion or Beetle. It's subtle though, and tires also play into it a lot. I find that I get better grip with the older Scorpion tires than I do with the newer Turbo Scorpion tires, but it all depends on the surfaces you run on. The Turbo Scorpion also has a slightly different body design and the provision for light buckets, which give the buggy, when it's complete, a much larger feeling to it than the Scorpion. Speaking of light buckets though, I'm just going to digress a bit here. Kyosho's kit quality is, as I've said before, top notch. Everything is very well made. The parts, materials used is excellent. One area that I have found Kyosho to be lacking is, out of the 9 buggies that I built, I want to say 3, maybe 4 of them have issues with the incorrect parts supplied or not enough parts. Usually it tends to be things like screws. Wrong length screws, wrong size screws, not enough screws, screws of a different type. Minor issues, minor niggles. Though in the case of the Turbo Scorpion, when I came to fit the light buckets onto the roll cage, I noticed there were no attachment points, and it turned out that I'd been given the standard Scorpion roll cage rather than the Turbo Scorpion one. Minor thing again, but just something to be aware of. If you're not sure whether to go for the Turbo Scorpion over the regular Scorpion or the Beetle, I would say go with the Turbo Scorpion. It's a little bit more money, but you get a better handling car, in my opinion, a slightly better looking car, and it's just all around positive. The only downside I would say is, at least where I run, the tires on the Scorpion and the Beetle and the Tomahawk grip better in the grass than the tires that came with the Turbo Scorpion. It's a minor thing that can be easily changed. 1986 also saw the release of the Turbo Optima Bling, before Bling was even a thing. As Glenn would say on RC Legends, it's a thing of beauty. I mean, the chassis certainly stands out with all that anodized gold. Now, I believe back in the day, the differences between the standard Optima and the Javelin and the Turbo Optima were much more pronounced. But with the modernization updates that Kyosho have applied to their re-releases, the gap has narrowed somewhat. That said, there are still plenty of minor differences that justify the cost of the Turbo. Obviously, the most notable difference is the extensive use of gold anodized aluminium. When built just like the Optima and Javelin before it, the Turbo Optima has this real sense of heft, solidness, robustness, quality, and it's really enhanced by the gold. I have very few buggies that when I built them I really don't want to run them, but the Turbo Optima was certainly one of those. It was a really, really tough decision to make to run that buggy for the first time, but I knew I had to run it. I can fully understand anybody that builds up a Turbo Optima and decides to just put it on a shelf. I fully understand that decision. So going back to the differences, much like the Turbo Scorpion, the newer Turbo Optima uses 2.2-inch wheels front and rear, so you can use modern day wheels and tires. But there are also a lot of smaller, minor differences that really don't become apparent until you've got the two side by side. Just to list a few off the top of my head. The Turbo Optima comes with anti-roll bars front and rear. I digress slightly here. A word of caution: the fit between the ball adjusters and the plastic arms is very, very tight, and you're highly likely to split the plastic if you're not careful. I recommend you warm the plastic up slightly before trying to install the ball adjusters. Underneath, the Turbo Optima has the optional chassis guard, and the dampers have twisting collars for quick preload adjustment. I should also mention the Turbo Optima does not include the chain in the kit, so if you want to use a chain drive, you need to purchase the chain separately, but it does include the sprockets. And finally, in 1986, towards the end, we saw the release of the two-wheel drive Ultima. It's hard to understate the impact this buggy had when it first came out in 1986. So Kyosho, basically, they took what they'd been doing with the four-wheel drives, the Optima, the Turbo Optima, and they basically moved it over to the two-wheel drive. So it was a huge departure from the earlier Scorpion, Turbo Scorpion series. Very much more modern design. One of the big changes, obviously, is the aluminium monocoque bathtub type chassis, and once again with the other re-releases in the Legendary series, Kyosho went through and thoroughly modernized the manufacturing process. Lots of small changes to the design to make it suitable for modern day electronics. I mentioned this before, but if you go and check out RC Hobby Shed's channel, he did a very in-depth review comparison between an original Kyosho Ultima and a re-release. It's an eye-opener just how much they changed, because at first glance, superficially, they look very similar, but when you dig deeper, you can really find how much Kyosho changed the design for the better. So the best way to describe the Ultima is if you took a Optima and just turned it into a two-wheel drive. Certainly when it comes to suspension geometry, gearbox layout and things like that, gone are the trailing arms found on the Scorpion, replaced now with suspension very similar to that of the Optima. Likewise, the gearbox, again, very similar to the Optima. The buggy itself is very, very narrow, particularly with the body attached. It has quite a unique look. Incidentally, one of the big downsides of the body, I find, is it's very tedious to put on and off. It's one of those bodies where once you put it on, you don't want to take it off again. It's a snug fit to say the least. But the updates to the suspension and design pay dividends when it comes to performance. It's by far the best performing of the bunch, the two-wheel drives anyway, and it's the most suited to handling higher power motors. Incidentally, my Ultima runs a 15-turn single brush motor, and it is properly quick, and it can handle that power with ease. I've tried similar setup in my Scorpion, and it just wasn't as controllable. And that brings us to 1987 and the release of the Optima Mid, which is to date the final buggy to be released in the Legendary series. What can I tell you about that? Well, my recommendation is go to the Kyosho YouTube channel. I'll put a link down in the description. Go and watch the video by Kogawa-san, the man behind the vintage series development. He talks in detail about the R&D design for the Optima Mid. It's a thoroughly enjoyable watch. He's speaking Japanese, but there are excellent English subtitles. I highly recommend you go check out that video. In the video, he talks about how the track surfaces were changing towards the latter half of the 1980s, and that meant Kyosho could go with their midship design and move the motor forward inboard and not have to worry too much about traction issues. The benefits of that are obviously smaller packaging, better weight distribution, and just more maneuverability overall. The Optima Mid, much like the Ultima, are significantly different when compared to the earlier releases in the Kyosho Legendary series. They're much more akin to modern day design, so gone are the parallel chassis rails. In the case of the Optima Mid, you have a lower aluminium deck and an upper deck. If you're considering the vintage series and you put more emphasis on old school design, mechanisms, styling, then I would recommend against picking up the Optima Mid or Ultima. There's nothing wrong with them. They're fantastic buggies and by far the best performing of the Legendary series, but they're also the most modern and most akin to modern day buggy designs. I really like the old school way of doing things, and so consequently, out of the 9 Legendary series buggies, I would personally, I rank the Optima Mid and the Ultima right at the bottom of my favorites. Most people would disagree with me, and the Optima Mid enjoys huge popularity with good reason. But for me personally, after building the others in the Legendary series, I just found that I didn't really connect so much with the Optima Mid. It just felt too modern for me. Other people will probably think differently. Talking about the Optima Mid, it's a mid-motor mount design, so that means space in the chassis is at a premium. You can fit slightly larger ESCs, but you may need to modify the upper deck. Kyosho designed it primarily in mind to fit their Le Mans ESC, which fits perfectly, by the way. And even without a cooling fan, it never gets hot. I mean, credit where credit due. The Optima Mid is a fantastic handling buggy. It really does drive very well. And if you prioritize outright performance over, vintage styling and construction, then definitely go with the Optima Mid for 4-wheel drive or the Ultima for 2-wheel drive. I think ultimately the best advice I can give someone who is looking to buy their first Legendary Series, and once again I stress, any Legendary Series first purchase is most likely not going to be your last because they are highly addictive. But if you are, debating which one to go with, they're all great, so just pick one that you really like the look of. If you're not going to be racing it regularly, they're all fine, but if you are planning to take it to a track and perhaps compete in a vintage race series, then depending on the rules, regulations of that particular event, I would recommend the later Buggies for track-oriented performance, and the earlier Buggies if you prioritize just the old school way of doing things and just want a unique and interesting build experience and running experience. I began this video by saying that they don't make them like they used to. I think this perfectly describes how I feel about the Kyosho Legendary Series of re-releases. On the one hand, they're miniature time capsules of the past that evoke strong feelings of nostalgia for all those who grew up with them. But at the same time, they're not made like they were back in the day, with numerous subtle but meaningful improvements and enhancements that make them more durable and better suited to modern day electronics and tracks. With the Kyosho Legendary Series, you truly do get the best of both worlds. I for one hope that Kyosho continue to add more Buggies to their Legendary Series lineup. Well, I'm going to wrap up here because I've been talking way too long. If anybody has any specific questions on the Buggies, leave a comment below and I will do my best to answer as many of them as I can. My name is David, you've been watching Kai City RC, I'll catch you in the next one. Oh, and if you enjoy watching these videos, please consider subscribing. It's free, it won't cost you anything, and it really does help the channel out. See you next time.